I'm going to talk to you today about presentation skills and public speaking, which is particularly important for parents and carers. Often we're in meetings and events where there's other people there that might be scary, that might be in positions of power. And so as an individual parent, it feels hard to make your voice heard. So the tips I'm going to give you today will make life easier. So there's 5 key stages when you're starting to think about your presentations. The first stage is to plan your presentation. Second stage is to prepare your visual aids. Third stage is to prepare yourself. Then it's actually about standing up and speaking in public. And then finally, it's predicting questions that you might be asked along the way. In terms of planning your presentation, the first thing to do is to try and generate as much information and as many ideas as possible on the thing you want to talk about. So when I'm doing it, I usually start with a blank piece of paper and start a good few weeks before the presentation's due. And then we have to really be harsh with ourselves. We have to narrow it down. Think about your core message and think about repeating the core message. Now, a message that's said just once has a 10% chance of being remembered, but a message repeated 6 times has a 90% chance of being remembered. So it's worth thinking about what do you want to get across to your audience. And once you know what you want to get across, you structure your presentation around that. Prepare some cue cards, some little cards that you can hold on to and look at when you're talking to your audience and looking around. And that way, if you do get lost and you do forget your words, you've got them there. The secret, the real secret when it comes to planning your presentation, is to think about what can you do for your audience. It's not about the fact that you have something to say, but what would you provide to them? What answers and solutions can you give rather than just identifying what the problems are? Because as parents and carers, we might have all sorts of problems we identify, but if we want to work in partnership with others, we need to provide some of the solutions as well. The second stage, when it comes to the presentation, is to think about the visual content. Think about the visual aids you want to use. Now, PowerPoint is the common one that's used these days, but there's some mistakes people often make when it comes to PowerPoint. The first thing is to produce all your words on slides. And then what you do is you turn and you look at the screen and you read the words off the screen. And all the energy and all the presentation skills that you've got just goes into the screen and none of it goes into your audience. So it's much better to keep it simple. Have simple images, diagrams, or just 1 or 2 words. And resist the temptation to use bullet points on PowerPoint. The temptation is you have 5 or 6 bullet points on the screen because there's a template there and you think you can just use that template. The reality is your audience can read faster than you can speak. So again, reduce those bullet points down. They become very boring, very tedious. The idea of using photos is one that parents and carers really can make the most of because you know children. You've got children that you will know and you know the problems. So try this technique called characterization, where you tell the story of a particular child. Rather than trying to tell the story of lots of children in one area, tell just one child's story. Focus on that and then expand it up to children in the area more widely. People will find it far easier to engage about one child than about too many. But be careful. Don't necessarily talk about your child. We have huge amounts of passion and enthusiasm and care for our own children, but that can get in the way of our message sometimes. So talk to other parents, find out what the issues are for them, and then use their child as the example. The third stage is the crucial one. It's preparing yourself. Now, we're all going to get nervous when it comes to doing presentations. Everybody does. That's natural. The more you do, the less nerves you get. But in part of that preparation for yourself, there's a couple of nerve reduction techniques we can use. The first is to think about what could go wrong. Make a big long list of all the possible things that could go wrong. Now, don't get scared at that point because the temptation is to think, oh, all those things are going to go wrong. Instead of that, stop and then think, well, if that happened, what would I do? And so you have a plan for everything that might possibly go wrong in your presentation. For instance, you think, I'm going to forget my words. That's the common one that people often say. Well, you're going to have cue cards. So if you forget your words, you've got some cards to read. It makes it so much easier. And then the second thing, in terms of reducing your nerves, is to think, well, what can I do to start to tell in my head that this is going to work better? So instead of saying, oh, I don't like presentations and telling everyone that you're really bad at them, stop that and start saying, well, actually, this is a really good opportunity for me. I'm going to enjoy this. And then as soon as you start to tell yourself you might enjoy this, On the day of the presentation, you're far more likely to have a good time. The other things, very simple practical things in terms of preparing yourself, is to do some copies of your visual aids, have handouts if you're going to give handouts, having some water, some tissues, and thinking about what you're going to wear. It's useful to think about getting the right clothing for the audience. As a general rule, wear the clothing that your audience will be wearing. So if there's people in suits, you need to dress in a suit. If there's people in jeans and t-shirts, maybe dress a little bit smarter, but you don't have to turn up in your big suits. Like any skill, presentations, public speaking, the more you do, the easier it gets. So one of the best bits of preparation we can do is to rehearse, and then rehearse, and then rehearse some more. By rehearsing regularly, the nerves will reduce because you know what you're going to say. You'll be less reliant on reading the words. And by rehearsal, I don't mean just reading quietly your notes to yourself. Read the words out loud. Look at yourself in the mirror and rehearse, ideally with a clock or a watch, because that way you know how long you'll take. And try rehearsing to other people, friends and family. Get them to give you some feedback on what you're doing. Definitely the best thing to do is to video yourself or record yourself delivering your presentation. By doing that, you really start to get a sense of how you're coming across to your audience and what you might need to do. There's lots of different reasons why we're going to be nervous on the day. And to understand those reasons will start to help. So it might just be novelty. It might be the first time we've ever stood on a stage or spoken in front of people at a meeting. It might be that there's people in positions of power in the audience and we feel like we don't have very much of a voice. We might be used to speaking to parents and carers in our group, but then speaking to a bigger audience, it becomes different. Or maybe you've just had a bad experience in the past, and so you've still got that in the back of your mind from school when you had to stand on stage and give an assembly. Try and get rid of those thoughts, because we're naturally going to be nervous. And one of the temptations is to think that everyone in the audience will know how nervous you are. So let's think about that a bit more. Actually, your audience are going to be looking at you. That's going to happen. But you're not going to know whether or not they're interested in what you're saying, bored with what you're saying, or just thinking about what they're going to have for their tea tonight. So don't try and pick up on subtle clues that your audience may or may not be giving you. Just keep going, because you don't know what's in their heads. The other thing is that the audience won't see what's inside you. We often have the butterflies in the stomach, or slightly sweaty palms, or we feel like our voice is cracking up. But actually the audience won't know those things, so don't point it out to them. If you don't tell them you're nervous, how will they know? The only thing we need to control is leaking. And leaking are the little signs that we do that show we're nervous. So for instance, women with long hair will often spend a lot of time when they're nervous putting their hair behind their ears. Or men will put their hands in their pockets and jingle change in their pockets. Try and remove those distractions and those signs of nervousness. On the day of your presentation, you're going to be nervous. That's understandable. There's a few things you can do before you actually deliver your presentation though. Try to think about your face. Your face is just full of muscles. And like any athlete or performer, you have to warm the muscles up before you start to use them. So think of yourself about chewing a piece of gum, but make that gum quite large. And then chew the gum, and so it goes all around your face, and all your face muscles get nice and exercised. In that way, your muscles will be warm and your voice projection will be so much better. The other thing is we can warm up our voice with simple exercises. For instance, red lorry, yellow lorry is a useful way of working out how fast you need to be speaking and getting used to talking out loud. Obviously, you don't want to do either of those things in front of people. So take yourself off to the loo before the presentation and just warm up a bit first. When you're there and you're preparing to speak in the meeting or at the conference or the event you're at, some simple things we can do are just concentrate on our breathing. When we get nervous, we tend to breathe more than we should do. So really try and breathe in deeply and hold the breath and then very slowly let it out. And that will control some of those feelings of nerves. The other thing is to think about your body. And try tensing up your feet and then up to your legs and then your chest and your stomach and your neck and your arms, and then very gradually, once all those things are tense, just let them out. And you'll find a lot of the nervous energy and those butterflies in the stomach that are building up and building up will start to be released. It then becomes your turn to speak. And then it's over to you. You've done your preparation, you know what you want to say, you've got your visual aids if you're having some, so you know what you want to do there. And you're warmed up, you're all ready to go, so now you can enjoy it. And think of it as enjoyment if you can. If not, think of it as just getting through it. Get to the end and that'll be enough. Remember, the golden rule of presentations is don't talk for longer than you should. An audience never ever minds if you sit down early, but they will mind if you stop them getting to their coffee break or the lunch. So stick to your time. If that means you leave some of your presentation out, that's okay. There's always the questions later. The trick when we're on stage is to look confident. If we look confident, our audience has confidence in us. And when our audience has confidence in us, then we grow in confidence. And that's a beautiful circle. However, if we look nervous, our audience become fidgety and worried. And then if the audience start to fidget and worry, our nerves go and then it all goes downhill. So we can trick the audience into thinking we're confident. Very simple things. Eye contact is really important. Have eye contact with every member of the audience. Even the ones that aren't smiling, even the ones that aren't looking at you, they're looking at their notes. Even the ones that are looking grumpy. Try and have eye contact with everybody. And if you're talking to a large room, remember the people at these sides, the lefts and the rights, are the ones we tend not to talk to quite as much because it's easier to keep our heads in one line. So by talking to people left and right, just means that everyone in the room knows we're looking at them. Now this is where, if you've done your planning, there's no questions you won't be asked that you don't know the answer to, because you'll have researched everything you need beforehand. But holding a few of your visual aids back, so if you've got 1 or 2 slides that the audience haven't seen, when they then ask you a question, it looks like you're super well prepared when you can show them a new visual aid and talk about something extra. And it gets you extra time during your presentation that maybe you weren't asked to give. Often we'll be asked questions that might be challenging, they might be difficult, and that's okay. That's the right of the audience to ask us questions, it's only fair. And there's 2 simple things we can do. If you're asked a question and you don't know the answer, very simply, you say you don't know the answer. That's fine. Offer to get back to them later. Take their details, find out and get back to them. Or you can be a bit sneaky. You can say something like, that's a really good question. Does anyone else have any thoughts on what the answer might be? And that means the rest of the audience suddenly have to wake up. They suddenly have to think about what that question was. And best of all, it gives you some thinking time. And that way you can start to formulate what your answer might be without having to be put on the spot. There will be some tricky people in our audience sometimes, and that's okay, that happens. With those tricky people, when they ask you a difficult question, have lots of eye contact with them, lots of nodding, show that you're really listening to them and trying to understand what it is they have to say. And then talk to them, give them the answer. And once you've given them the answer, then ask if there's any other questions elsewhere in the room without looking at that tricky person. And there's a good chance somebody else in the audience will help you out with an easier question. So often when we think we're going to get lots of difficult questions at the end, we don't. My final tip on giving presentations is to warn the audience when you're coming to the end. It's a useful thing to do. It just wakes them up. It makes them think, oh, I need to applaud in a minute, or I need to move on to the next agenda item. So always end with a "and finally," or "just to finish off," or "here's my final thought." So here is my final thought. We've looked at the 5 stages of giving presentations. From planning what you want to say, producing your visual content, preparing yourself, performing to actually the audience on the day, and then predicting questions. You're ready to go. Have a good time.